Okay, welcome everybody to our AVERT webinar. We're delighted to have you with us, and we're also delighted to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Helen Young from Deakin University. Helen is going to be speaking with us about creating conditions for radicalization to white, far-right violent extremism, medievalist video games, and gaming. Now, Helen is going to be looking at the role that's played by games, gaming platforms, and gaming culture in relation to how these very complex ecosystems can enable radicalization to white far-right extremism. And she's going to be paying special attention to radicalization to extremism in both cognitive and emotional contexts and dimensions, and also to the role of medieval tropes and discourse in both gaming culture and right-wing extremist attack narratives. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating talk of great interest to the AVERT community and those people who have been able to join us for today's webinar. Just a little bit of background for Helen. Dr. Young is a lecturer in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University. She holds a PhD in medieval literature at the University of Sydney, and has also held a DECRA Research Fellowship. And she's also worked in education, communication, and nursing research. So she brings that wonderful, broad interdisciplinary lens to her work. Helen is a fellow of the Deakin Motion Lab, and she is also a member of the AVERT network. And we're absolutely delighted to have her with us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded so that we're able to upload it after the session for those people who were interested but unable to be with us for today's webinar itself. If you have questions, which we most certainly hope that you do so that we can have a good, robust discussion with Helen after she's done presenting, please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screens. Post your questions there, and we will come to as many of them as we can after Helen's presentation is finished. So with that, Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm just going to share my screen with you, which I trust is now showing. All right. Okay, so video games and gaming sites are increasingly of concern regarding radicalisation to far-right extremism, largely due to the creation of for-purpose games and activity of hate organisations on gaming websites and forums, or at least these are the things that have drawn the most sort of public attention. But there's relatively little research on radicalisation in gaming to date that is informed by game studies. And although gaming spaces have much in common with other online communities, there's value in understanding their specific nature. So I want to focus on mainstream games and gaming rather than on those that are created by extremist organisations today. And I'm coming to this research from a background of multidisciplinary work on race and racism in popular culture. So the overarching question that I'm working towards an answer to is why are games and game environments conducive to far-right radicalisation? So I want to start by just talking a little bit about what I actually mean by radicalisation. So I'm working with Hafez and Mullen's concept of radicalisation as a process of socialisation into the extremist worldview that deems legitimate the use of violence as a method to affect societal and political change. Daniel Kohler's concept of radicalisation as a process of depluralisation, which may or may not ultimately lead to violence, is also useful. And for me, this is because it enables consideration of the interplay of multiple factors in radicalisation to violent extremism. What I want to suggest is that games, gaming spaces and gaming culture are an ecosystem that work to depluralise worldviews and normalise violence as a key, even the only useful mode of action. So I'm focusing on some significant particulars of games, gaming communities and gaming culture. And I mention these three things specifically because research in these sorts of areas often separates them. That is, it talks about game narratives and mechanics as separate to the online communities of players that form around them, and as separate to the games industry. Based on my and others' work on race and racism in popular culture, that offers at best quite limited insights. Game content is influenced by gamers who influence and are influenced by the gaming industry, and so on. And none of these things are separate from wider culture or society. Affect and money flow between them all. They're the dual currencies of the gaming economy. Quite simply, people pay to play games because they enjoy doing so, and it all sort of works outwards from there. This interconnectedness of games, people, even ideas, needs to be understood to get at why video games and gaming are fertile ground for far-right radicalisation. So I want to talk first about medievalism, because this is one of the ways that games and gaming connect to broader cultural paradigms of identity quite substantially. So in the contemporary popular imagination, the European Middle Ages were muddy, bloody, and, as I've argued elsewhere, whites only. And if you've watched Game of Thrones, this will be reasonably familiar. So details of this are a matter for a book-length study, but one might reasonably argue that the diverse and complex realities of medieval Europe have already undergone a process of depluralisation, lasting several centuries in the Western popular imagination, rendering it an ideal site for white masculinist heterosexist fantasy, open for extremist exploitation. As Linda Schlegel points out in her recent article on gaming, gamification and radicalisation, and I'm quoting here, many contemporary extremist movements advocate a return to a glorified past. The praised future vision Kohler identifies as key to process of radicalising depluralisation often has its roots in and legitimises itself through reference to a nostalgically imagined past. The Middle Ages, as Andrew Elliott has explored at length, is used in this way by both the white far right and Islamic extremists. Some salient evidence of the former can be seen in the images I have on this slide, but also the manifestos of both the Oslo and Christchurch terrorists, and a really sort of wide range of other places. So far-right extremists have been using medievalist popular culture as a recruiting ground online since at least the early 2000s, when Derek Black started a forum dedicated to Lord of the Rings and high fantasy on Stormfront, with the explicit aim of recruiting. As he told the New York Times a couple of years ago, he said, "I figured you could get people who liked, with such a white mythos, a few turned on by white nationalism." And it is a very popular site on Stormfront. Well, those forums are very popular. When it comes to video gaming, there is already a self-identified community of people who position themselves in ways that align with white extremist identities, specifically heterosexual male white identities, and that is gamers. So gamers are a subset of people who play games. Not everyone who plays would say a simple yes if asked whether they are one. Graham Kirkpatrick shows that gamer is a particular identity that emerged in the late 20th century due to economic and social factors, and through specific interpolation by gaming magazines and companies of a young male audience, and also principally a white audience, although Kirkpatrick doesn't talk about that specifically. Although there has been some pushback against this, gamer remains associated strongly with young white heterosexual males, and it's a powerful concept that shapes the product that game studios produce. So most games, and certainly most mainstream games, cater at least to the preferences of this sort of imagined audience. Gamers always understood themselves to be marginalized. So in the late 90s, they were sort of positioned as teenage nerds and geeks, shunned by girls and bullied by jocks. As Brendan Keogh puts it, and I'm quoting here, "The persecution complex of the nerd gamer persists to the modern day and is the driving force behind the enduring notion of a homogenous gamer identity. This persecution complex has, if anything, intensified in the last several years, not least because of the broader political context in which powerful actors, including Donald Trump, among others, position white heterosexual males as marginalized and persecuted by feminists, multiculturalists, globalists, and so on. So gamer aligns with the broader category of white heterosexual male. Narratives of victimization and resistance reinforce preconceived perceptions of belonging to a community under threat. Now, this exchange is from Steam, a major gaming website, and this is from a chat forum just the week before last. So the alignment between gamer and, well, Aryan gamer and sort of extremist position as labelled by another participant on the chat site is made really clear here. And this sort of equation of the two is not at all difficult to find. This was the top hit on my search when I started looking. In their recent analysis of pathways to violent extremism, Michael Jensen and others argue that the causes are complex, but find that perceptions of community victimization are one of two constant variables, and one which they state may separate violent from non-violent radicals. Research on radicalisation has shown for more than a decade that perceptions of victimisation and persecution are as powerful as the realities. So in gamers, the far right finds a self-created group identity that already existed or already exists with politics and positions that are closely aligned, even when they are not made as explicitly linked as they are on the screen at the moment. Okay, so Schlegel suggests that video games with extremist content may play a part in facilitating susceptibility to radicalisation by familiarising individuals with narrative structures, such as a return to a glorified past, the importance of individual agency, and individual capability, if not duty, to fight evil. So games made by extremist organisations, and they've been doing this again since at least the early 2000s, the earliest one I know is from about 2002, clearly fall under the rubric of extremist content. But Schlegel's account of what that looks like is equally a summary of a very significant number of mainstream popular games, particularly, although not exclusively, medievalist games, both historical and fantasy alike. And I'm going to use BioWare's franchise, the Dragon Age franchise, as some illustrative examples of what I'm talking about here. And I've chosen them largely because the company is widely considered one of the more progressive or politically progressive major studios, and might therefore be assumed to be relatively unlikely to be deliberately embedding politics that would align with far-right agendas in its games, although there are studios that are reasonably well recognised as doing so deliberately. The franchise, to give some salient examples of this, includes player characters that can be made to resemble people of colour within some limits, can be female, and can engage in same-sex romance. The franchise engages with themes of racial and religious discrimination and oppression, and discrimination against refugees. It is also, in this context, worth noting that the first two games in the franchise were mentioned by the Oslo terrorists as ones that he played for fun. Now, the Dragon Age franchise also engages in medievalist historical authenticity discourse that associates the European Middle Ages with racial whiteness. In doing so, it constructs what Schlegel terms a retrotopian world that projects contemporary white subjectivities back into the past, authorising them as real and stable over time, even though the game itself is set in a fantasy world featuring, well, dragons, magic, various other things. They are, in this sense, sorry, I've lost my place for a minute. Okay, the narratives of all three games to date centre on individual agency, capability, and duty to fight evil. They are, in this sense, entirely typical of not only medieval games, but video games much more broadly. So I'm going to go now to the trailer for the most recent offering in the franchise, just to give you a sense of what they are like, but also, and more importantly, to to give you a sense of how the player character is positioned. And I'm hoping that you can hear the audio. Somebody give me a wave. If not, I'm just going to skip forward to the sort of most relevant bit so we don't get the first minute or so of extraneous material. You might want to take the chance to turn your audio down slightly because it is quite loud.
So no audio, I don't think, Helen.
No audio. Okay. I'm going to turn on the captions and see if that works. I'm not sure if it will. So I'm not sure if you caught all of the details of the voiceover, but it resonates very strongly with Schlegel's points about individual agency and capability and duty to fight evil. Bennett, Furlow and Goodall, analysing extremist narratives and rhetoric and their links to violence, found that Islamic and US far-right extremists alike, and I'm quoting again here, make productive use of a core narrative that posits a world in chaos and disorder that must be set right again by political action inspired and ordained by the divine. There are very clear resonances here with the trailer of Dragon Age and the way that the player character is positioned right throughout the game. In each game, the player character begins as an unremarkable person who is drawn into a major conflict unprepared and not entirely willingly. They develop exceptional skills throughout the game until they become a legendary figure who defeats evil and restores order. Agency is achieved through enacting violence, including politically motivated violence, as I'll return to in a moment. As examples of highly conventional narrative structures, they are illustrative of how closely aligned mainstream and extremist narratives can be. The familiarity of such narratives in games and other aspects of popular culture is part of what makes gaming a fertile ecosystem for radicalisation. Media effects theories have been invoked in research into games and violence, extremist or otherwise, but there is a lack of strong evidence, despite numerous attempts to find it, that video games cause violent behaviour. Hafez and Mullen's argument that adoption of worldviews which legitimate violence as a method to effect societal or political change is key to radicalisation, however, offers another way of considering the issue. Video games of many different genres, and particularly mainstream games in the most popular genres, so first-person shooters, role-playing games like Dragon Age is, action-adventure, even strategy games, typically position violence as the principal form of agency a player can have. For a game to not require the player character to commit violence on multiple occasions to progress in the game is exceptional, especially when political or social action in the world of the game is required. So the Dragon Age franchise, particularly the second and third games, makes much of the options open to players of the choices they have about how to interact with non-player characters and the wider game world. However, these choices are in effect surface level. There's no way to play the games without systematic murderous violence of people and a range of other beings. There are also narrative choke points where no matter what the approach the the player has taken is, or the alliances they've formed, the player character must participate in political violence, or the player must abandon the game. Game mechanics, the systems through which one plays, are equally typically centered on violence. Game scholar Rowan Tulloch argues that games are inherently learning environments. Among other things, one must learn the mechanics to be able to play. This means learning how to commit violence, and also often learning to manage multiple systems, that are focused on enabling one to do so more and more effectively. So developing the capability throughout the game. Dragon Age Inquisition is an illustrative example. The first things the player learns to do are move towards a fight and to engage in combat. There are also crafting systems which mostly focus on forging weapons and armor. Every character in the party must be armed by the player, and this must be maintained throughout the game. So you have to come back and keep doing this, keep making all of the characters you can play as better and better at committing violence. Given the structuring of violence into narratives and mechanics alike, games can be understood as processes for learning and teaching violence as a viable, even necessary form of political and social agency, in line with Hafez and Mullen's insights. They also link violence to efficacy and capability. So I want to turn now to the online communities that form through and around games and gaming. There are countless forums. Some are text chat boards run by gaming studios or by fans themselves. Others operate through social media, and particularly social media forms that are used or known to be used by extremists. So Gab, Discord, Telegram, and games are common topics on dedicated extremist sites. There's been significant work around the role of online communities and group dynamics in radicalisation and encouraging lone actor terrorist violence. So these are spaces that warrant some attention. So one issue is the public presence and activity of openly extremist groups. So for example, this is probably a familiar example, a group calling itself the Atomwaffen Division, very likely including members associated with the militia of the same name, drew attention for its unfettered activity on the gaming platform Steam for at least a year before it was banned. I think that was late last year they banned that particular one and some others. But the public existence of such groups, and they are still there. So I took the image that I've got up here this afternoon. It's one of multiple examples of openly extremist groups on Steam, which is one of the biggest gaming sites. So one of the issues here is that the public existence of such groups is that they can allow people already holding extremist ideas to find each other and build connections, although this is, of course, not specific or unique to gaming sites. A second concern with such groups is that they might be spaces where the dynamics work to incite violent acts from members who were already cognitively radicalised before joining. And I'd suggest that anyone who joined an overtly neo-Nazi group is already radicalised. I don't know of any instance where this has been shown to happen, but that doesn't mean it hasn't. And it's an area that I think, although I'm interested to pursue, if possible, particularly given how emotion circulates in gaming communities, and some attention being paid to emotion in the scholarship on radicalisation and violence by David Matsumoto and others. Such groups can collectively play out fantasies of in-group belonging. For example, in the whites-only historical game worlds of medieval Europe, and violence against outgroups, often in the same game. Doing so repeatedly and in collaboration strongly associates positive affect with violent acts against an outgroup. And also pause here to note that a vast number of mainstream games offer opportunities for playing out far-right fantasies. That ranges sort of from the preventing the fall of Constantinople to making Nazis win the Second World War to playing as praised historical figures. So Julius Evola is an option in Hearts of Iron 4. When it comes to building a sense of in-group identity, positive affect is very significant, as Sarah Ahmed has argued. and Ahmed writing of white racist hate groups and their online communities suggests that the passion of negative attachment to others, that is the outgroup, is redefined simultaneously as a positive attachment of the imagined white subjects, that is the in-group. Popular culture is one focus for positive attachment. Games in particular offer literal opportunities to play together, as well as narratives through which white identities can be constructed. It's clear when you start looking at Steam discussion boards that far-right presence is not limited to these sorts of groups, however. So the person who made these comments, the ones I had up before, is far from alone. Steam has, and this is just sort of one example, more than 100 players using Aryan or a variant, Super Aryan and that sort of thing as their profile name, for example. So extremist flags are sort of part of the landscape. Gaming forums and platforms are, like other social media, designed to connect people with others who have similar interests and views. So Steam, for example, is specifically designed to encourage players to make friends and join groups. Its affordances for doing this, such as suggesting players recently encountered in games as friends, make it easy for someone actively seeking to radicalize others to contact and potentially target players who exhibit any openness to their views, perhaps through comments on chat or during play. When you start looking at how Steam works as a site, I think it would be difficult to design something that worked better to allow people who were actively seeking to radicalize to target individuals. I want to turn now from thinking about groups and individuals to entire online communities. Like other online fan communities, discussion boards focused on games, whether they're mainstream or already extremist sites, are interpretive communities. That is, they're social spaces built around particular ways of reading or understanding a text and through it, the world. So Lucy Bennett argues that right ways of reading are constructed through power struggles in which oppositional identities are policed and, where possible, suppressed under the normative identity of a given community. Now she's writing about music fandom there, but the same sort of patterns and dynamics have been sort of operate across different kinds of fan communities. These tussles play out over thousands and tens of thousands of threads, some of which have thousands of comments within them. So I thought some illustrative examples might be useful here. So this is from a thread posted on the Kickstarter page of an historically accurate, and you can perhaps imagine my quote marks there, medievalist game called Kingdom Come Deliverance. So the thread was posted by the game developers, asking backers what they did not want to see in the game. There were numerous comments against racial and cultural diversity posted over the span of almost 2 years, and this is just one example. The repetition of exclusionary comments demonstrates that this is a normative position within that community. Membership of the community is dependent on accepting the overall whiteness of the game without challenge. In this brief example, some of the interconnectedness that I mentioned earlier in the paper can be discerned. So the content is shaped by players or potential players even before it is made. The positioning of the game as historically accurate from its inception interpolates a particular political position that is closely aligned with white male heterosexual gamer identity. The game developers actively resisted suggestions made elsewhere that they could include people of colour or a female player character without being historically inaccurate, and their resistance was taken up so substantially by some supporters that the person who made that suggestion was still receiving death threats as a result of it 5 years later. My next thread is from a Dragon Age fan site, not something that's overtly extremist aligned and managed by fans themselves. The original poster noted within 24 hours of the Oslo terrorist attack that there was a disturbing similarity, I think they called it eerie similarity, between the bombing there and the bombing of a church building, with the successful aim of starting a civil war at the end of Dragon Age 2. by a character called Anders. The whole thread is too long to go through, but there are some repeated themes in the comments. So here we have a repeated concern that Breivik's actions will lead to games being blamed for them. So this relates back to my point about gamers understanding themselves as persecuted. I'd suggest that comments like these, which go unremarked and unchallenged, indicate that gamer identity is normative on this site. And the fact that they're made and are not sort of remarked on when, or that these are the consequences of those actions that people on this site are most concerned about, I think is quite telling that people who are operating here really understand themselves as gamers first and foremost. They show very little sort of interest in what the consequences of his actions might be outside their own community and own area of interest. Another common thread is that the comparison between reality and video games should not be made, and that there is something wrong with the person who originally posted and with others. So there's a real sort of pathologizing of the person who made this first, who first sort of noticed and commented on this similarity. And that pathologizing is part of a really sort of common trope in these sorts of online fan communities of positioning people who don't quite fit normative identity as not just being different, but as being wrongly different. So there's this sort of pathologization of the original poster and of others who might draw such comparisons or be inspired by video games to violence. In these comments, and I've left out the abusive ones, we can see some of the tussle over identity and interpretation of games themselves and of their influence. The general position is that games are fun, harmless, and should not be critiqued, particularly for anything that could be understood as political. And this is also a tenet of gamer identity, that whatever happens in a game is just fun, and you're being too politically correct if you suggest there's any sort of concern about the content. What we also have in the same thread is discussions of the validity of such actions, both in-game and in the real world, including comments such as these that at the very least find explanations and justifications for terroristic political violence. There's general agreement, however, that Anders in Dragon Age is fighting institutional oppression and corruption. And in quite a few of the comments, like the one at the top, Anders should be an inspiration to freedom likers everywhere. It's really not clear, and I think probably sometimes deliberately not clear, whether they're talking about the real person or about the video game. So the thread is ended with a sort of general agreement, although certainly not from all who contributed, that they send condolences and prayers to those who were affected. But it's very much a sort of afterthought after several days of discussion. So my final example here is from a Stormfront thread from a data set I was working with doing sentiment analysis 4 or 5 years ago. Medievalist video games and other popular culture generate higher levels of positive affect than any other topic I found on Stormfront, and higher than a random control sample as well. So in practice, normative readings within a community where identity and correct readings are clearly established, such as white supremacist identity is normative in this case, generate pleasure and are an opportunity to reinforce in-group positions. So the original poster in this thread asks if anyone else has played Dragon Age Origins, so the first game in the franchise, saying that they like it, and this is the first response that they receive. So we have here a sort of reinterpretation of the game that validates an identity construct that's already normative in the forum where they're having this discussion. A few months later, another person wrote this. So this is a topic that people keep coming back to. So they say, awesome game, I love playing as a Dalish elf. I can relate to their situation. When challenged on the comparison, and I should point out here that the game makers say that these elves are inspired by both Roma and Jewish culture and history, the person explains, yeah, you can read it, I won't read it out. There are certainly echoes of great replacement discourse here. This is from about 2010 from memory. So there's echoes of great replacement discourse here, but my broader point is that talking about games, even fantasy games, offers an opportunity for interpreting and reinterpreting reality through an extremist lens and solidifying in-group identity. So what I've sketched out here is just the tip of the iceberg in the interconnected network of games and gaming that one might through which one might explore, and I'm using Kieran Hardy's recent summary of factors that in radicalisation to violent extremism that have been identified through the research. So one might explore ideological, psychological, social, political, economic, and technological factors and the ways that they intersect in gaming spaces. Thinking about anti-radicalisation, the particularities of gamers, games and gaming communities should also be considered. What I've endeavoured to do here today is give an account of how some specific elements of games, gaming communities and gaming culture offer particular affordances for radicalisation by the far right. Gaming communities, like other fan communities, depluralise, and when the normative identity is gamer and already aligned closely with far right positions and content is made to appeal to that identity, the ecosystem for radicalisation is fertile. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Helen. I've got, you know, a number of burning questions in my own head, but folks who are on the webinar, please feel free. You can put your questions either in the Q&A, or actually you can also post questions in the chat, whatever is more comfortable for you. But we do already have a couple of questions that have come through. So one very interesting question really relates to, so let me frame this up a little bit for you. There is actually, I think, quite a lot of dualism in medieval culture. Yeah. And one of the things you've outlined very, very interestingly is the way in which it's not just about being a victim, nor is it just about being a hero or an avenger or a defender, but it's actually about the way in which both those seemingly polarized subject positions, you know, start to mesh and interact. So in that vein, and thinking specifically about the persecution complex that you identify, one participant has asked, what, in your view, is the relationship, for example, between incels and gamer identities? You also have some similar things happening around, you know, being persecuted, you know, being a victim, being deprived, and so forth.
There is a very close relationship. And I mean, one of the interesting things from my perspective, coming originally from medieval studies, is that medievalism is different brands of medievalism. One of the ways that I guess the far right extremists of different kinds connect. So one of my colleagues pointed out that the Christchurch Terrorists Manifesto is absolutely littered with medievalist references, some of which appeal to the sort of Viking Norse references that are appealing to men's rights activists. So you're getting sort of over towards incel communities there. There's the clash of civilization sort of discourses that appeal. You know, Trump supporters use those fairly frequently. So it's one of the sort of ways that you get points of connection between those groups. And my colleague's argument was that, well, what that manifesto was doing was appealing to or using medievalist references to appeal to as many parts of the far right as it possibly could. And to sort of market itself as being in group with those different communities, for lack of a better word. But certainly, sort of, to go back to the original question, there's a really strong connection between incels and gamer communities.
Okay. All right. So the next question, there's another few questions here. The next question is, I guess, a bit of a devil's advocate question in the sense that it's saying, look, okay, so you've painted a very compelling picture of all the different ways in which the gamer experience involves imaginative identification, with not only with violent scenarios, but with taking on particular roles, and with certain kinds of psychosocial experiences in terms of what you do within those violent scenarios. But how different is that, say, to exposure to violent narratives or fantasies or identification with violent protagonists, for example, in films, or in certain genres or subcultures of music? And so I think part of the question here is, we know that watching lots of violent films in itself is not a driver for people, to radicalize. But at the same time, is there something specific about the interactive nature of gaming, or about the relational aspect that actually means something different? So wondering if you could expand on the differences between exposure to violent narratives and scenarios with imaginative identification versus immersion in them through the relationships that gamers have with each other.
Yeah, look, I think you're sort of getting back to media effects theories here, at the root of the question. I don't think there isn't really any compelling evidence to suggest that playing video games, that just the act of playing video games is any more likely to lead one to violent action in the real world than reading violent books, watching violent movies, listening to particular kinds of music. I think one of the differences between those sorts of media and video games is more when you get into things like group dynamics, so playing with other people. And what I was getting at in this paper, which is the fact that there are fairly common, even sort of dominant identities that are specifically political. So the gamer identity positions people to understand themselves in particular ways because of the games that they play. So games, I think, lead people to interact with others in different ways, which have a greater potential to be exploited for purposes of radicalisation, and potentially, because of those dynamics, greater potential to lead to violent acts. Whereas you don't get, it's a very different thing to play a game together than to watch a movie together. When you play a game together, you have to interact with each other. You're functioning as a group. Whereas watching a movie together, you might then go and talk about it in an online community, and there are certainly discussions of movies, TV shows, all sorts of things in extremist spaces, but they don't have the same affordances for group interaction with the content.
Okay.
And there's no sort of identity attached to watching them in the same way. And the online communities are also something that gamers are more likely to spend a lot of time in, just by virtue of playing games as opposed to watching a specific movie.
Okay. So the next, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here that are basically both asking the same thing, and that's really on the issue of recruiting. So you've talked at some length about the fertile ground that the gaming ecosystem provides for violent extremist and terrorist recruiters to sort of be able to identify and then pursue targets in online gaming communities. Are you aware of any, so one question asks, are you aware of any research on the scope of this issue?
Mm.
And the second question asks, similarly, is there any evidence of the kinds of tactics or techniques that you might discern about how recruiters actually function in this space?
In answer to the first question, no, I don't know of any research into the scope of activity. Certainly, it's something that is of concern, but it's not. I don't know anybody who sort of had the resources or the impetus to really scope out how much is actually happening there. I've forgotten the second part of the
Okay,
question.
so
I'm sorry.
the second question is there evidence
Mm.
of how recruiters are actually operating in this space? For example, is anybody able to trace the way in which they might migrate their targets for recruitment into other online extremist spaces, or indeed take them into offline contexts? Although how you would follow that, in an online sense,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But it's really about whether you're aware of any evidence about the recruitment methodologies that are being brought to bear in this space. Is it just because it's relational, perhaps, but it's also well, anyway, is there any evidence?
Okay. I know that Matthew Sharp, who I'm not sure if he's here this evening, is doing some research into how looking at I'm not going to put it as clearly as he would, but how recruiters work in these sorts of spaces where they're using the same kinds of techniques, the same kinds of language as happens in other spaces. So I know it's something that people are beginning to look at. There's certainly evidence that of movement from, say, a community like Steam, which is, even though it's got a sort of public kind of neo-Nazi presence, does make some attempts at moderating, some attempts at sort of shutting that down. So you get things like these sorts of groups feeding people off to Gab and Discord channels to have their discussions.
Okay.
So saying things like, well, we're not able to say what we want on Steam forums. They'll shut us down. Come off to this channel where we can talk the way we like.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's certainly, I don't know if it's coming out of academic scholarship, but I've seen sort of research that shows that that kind of thing does happen. As for moving into offline spaces, I don't know.
Yeah.
No,
it's yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got another question here, and this is really a question about the age demographic for gamers in these online communities. So, are you seeing, for example, or are you aware of any research that's showing, how young are we talking about? Are we talking about 13 and 14-year-old kids, becoming involved in extremist spaces through gaming? What's your sense of the age demographic?
It's reasonably wide. So certainly I've seen some sort of or kind of evidence research that's showing that quite young kids are being targeted through gaming, particularly through YouTube, where there's a lot of playthrough. So people will record themselves playing the game and talk about it and then put it on YouTube. And these sorts of things are very popular. And there's sort of evidence, when you get kids who are 12 and 13 using terms like snowflake and triggered, the sorts of language that's used by gamers specifically, but also by the far right, liberal as a slur, this sort of thing. So certainly there's potential for exposure for kids that young. Whether they're being deliberately targeted, I don't know. I don't think it's unlikely, but it would certainly be possible. The average gamer is in their 30s.
Oh, okay.
But those sorts of demographics are problematic because when they count, are you a gamer, they count any kind of video game, including the sorts of things that you might play on your mobile on the bus or something like that. So it's very hard to know exactly what the demographics are. But yeah, certainly from teens well into at least the 30s would be the spread on a site like Steam.
Okay, so we've still got a couple of questions to go. I think we probably have time for one or two more. So one question is really about, you know, what should we be thinking about and what should we be doing in a more practical sense. And I think where this question seems to be coming from is the idea. Okay, so in lots of different dimensions of extremist right-wing culture. Think, for example, about memes. You know, where when people are challenged on the content or the messaging, say through meme culture, they say, "Hey, it was just a joke, right? It was just a joke. We weren't serious." And a lot of what you've outlined, I think, you know, resonates with that in the sense that it's just a game, right? We're just playing. I wondered myself actually if the name Steam community was related to the idea of letting off steam, for example. So, you know, to a certain extent, you can really talk about the way in which some of these cultural spaces are functioning as screens, yeah, where they can have seemingly legitimate social purposes that you can't really argue with, and yet we know that behind those screens, more sinister or concerning activity is taking place. So, what are your thoughts? The question here is, what are your thoughts about how we approach sort of camouflage? It's just a game, it's just a joke, in terms of really being able to tackle some of the dynamics that you've outlined that can, under some circumstances, enable radicalization.
Look, the short answer is I don't know. I don't know enough about anti-radicalization practice to make an informed sort of comment about that. But I suppose one of the things I was thinking about writing this paper is that you can't approach a gaming community as the same as working in the same way as you might another one. Certainly there are, yes, you're right, the sort of connections between meme culture and gaming are quite strong, and that similar sort of thing. Oh, it's just a game, it's just a game. If you think it's real, well, there's something wrong with you. That sort of positioning. You see those sorts of comments really frequently on gaming websites. So I think probably more what I'm getting at is that to do anti-radicalization work in gaming spaces, I think people probably need to understand how they work and what they're coming up against. And that's what I can talk about. But I don't know enough about anti-radicalization to sort of, I wouldn't want to speculate.
Okay. That actually does bring us to the end of the questions that we have, and it's probably quite a good note to finish on. We do have 1 or 2 minutes left if anybody else has a burning question. There's some nice comments coming through about brilliant paper and a few other things on the chat. But if there, I'll just make sure that I haven't missed anything here. But if there are no more questions from participants, can I thank you on behalf of everybody who has come along today? Really interesting and really valuable. And I think for a lot of us who are working on issues related to violent extremism and how we can best address radicalization to violent extremism and terrorism, this has been really useful, really thought-provoking, and very, very informative. So thank you once again. Can I just give a plug for our next webinar? For AVERT on the 19th of November, we are featuring as part of our international speaker series, Dr. John Horgan from Georgia State University, who will be known to many of you. John is going to be talking about his new forthcoming book and the tornado theory of the psychology of terrorism, which a lot of us are waiting for with bated breath. So please do sign up and register to hear John talk. Those of you